Again, good morning. It's good to be back. Okay, so here's the deal. I confess that I'm a political junkie. I suspect I'm not alone in this room in that regard. I've been known to stay up in the wee hours of the morning to see if there's an especially tight race for the White House. Occasionally I've even gotten up in the middle of the night during the 1976 election to see what was happening. Even during the endless primary season that we've had this year, I can't let a Tuesday night, super or otherwise, go by without checking to see who is in or who is out, to the consternation of my sometimes long-suffering spouse. Now, given this malady, one would think that this 2016 primary/caucus season would have been a cornucopia of riches. More than 20 candidates from all parts of the political spectrum, with the added spice given, of course, by Donald Trump. This should have been a true political junkie's dream. Yet it was not. Quite to the contrary, it's turned into a bit of a nightmare as far as I'm concerned. For one thing, it was way too long. I remember, it tells you how old I'm going to be on Wednesday, that when the presidential race didn't really get going until after the first of the year. Not until Jimmy Carter's improbable run did anyone particularly even care about the Iowa caucuses. The New Hampshire primary was first, and there were not all that many primaries to take into account. If we were lucky in Wisconsin, there might still be a contest when the circus got here, as happened in 1970 or 1976. But today, with all the debates, the straw polls, the state fair pig roasts, and all the rest, many candidates are in and out before the ball even drops on New Year's Eve in Times Square. Secondly, and more disturbing, this election has been more of a spectacle than a serious discussion of real issues. While the fall general election will show some sharp contrast in policy and ideology, during the primaries, the actual degree of difference among the candidates within each party were often minuscule. So the personality traits of the candidates often became the focus of the political discussion. Now, while there are many specific things that I could complain about this morning, I would like to focus on something that has become a particular pet peeve of mine in recent years. The social justice issues involving race, ethnicity, gender, gender identity, gender expression, and economic equality or inequality are serious and deserving of reasoned debate. President Obama and some other political leaders, to their credit, have attempted to put these issues on the front burner of our political dialogue so that we can try to address these issues in a meaningful way. Yet too often these efforts have been dismissed as pure political correctness and therefore not worthy of serious discussions. The issues are not seen as questions meriting consideration by our political leaders, but rather as distractions from the more important issues of the day, like what bathroom we must use. Calling something politically correct is intended to be a conversation stopper, an indication that it's not worth our time or attention. What I would like to suggest today is that these issues of justice cannot be so cavalierly dismissed, and that our failure to address them will cause long-term damage to our many communities. I would further argue that the most politically correct of them all was a first-century Galilean Jewish peasant named Jesus of Nazareth, who was revered by millions of people as their Lord and Savior, or at least as an important moral exemplar who people claim to admire, but often don't emulate in their actual behavior. What can the life and teachings of Jesus tell us about political correctness, and why is that even important? Now, to begin with, what exactly is meant by the phrase political correctness or politically correct? According to one online definition, political correctness, or as an adjective, politically correct, commonly abbreviated as PC, is a term which in modern usage is used to describe language, policies, or measures which are intended not to offend or disadvantage any particular group of people in society. The Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary suggests that to be politically correct is to agree with the idea that people should be careful not to use language or behave in a way that could offend a particular group of people. Now, while the phrase had fairly benign origins, in recent years it has undertaken pejorative overtones, particularly as applied to liberal points of views and policies. Caitlin Gibson, writing in the Washington Post, had this observation. These days, for some conservatives at least, it's a catch-all synonym for liberal cowardice and caution, whatever it is that's likely to keep America from being great or something. But politically correct is a linguistic weapon that has changed hands many times. It's been a literal term, an ironic joke, a snide insult. To some, the term has even represented a positive ideal, a righteous label to be worn proudly. According to Lila Lalami, writing in The Nation magazine in April, claims of political correctness, at least in its pejorative formulation, have been levied in these contexts, among others. The context of those who object when undocumented immigrants are labeled as criminals, rapists, or drug dealers. Those who oppose banning wholesale exclusion of Muslim immigrants. Those who oppose responding in kind to ISIS terrorists who behead Christians. Those who support equal availability of military combat roles for women service members. Or those who object to the bathroom laws, like the one recently enacted in North Carolina. Other actions and policies that have been dismissed as mere political correctness have included the promoting the use of gender-inclusive language, such as the changes made over the years by religious bodies, including our own, in hymns and other liturgical materials, requests for marriage equality, advocacy for the removal of the Confederate flag from government facilities, actively addressing issues of racial, gender, and other forms of bias on college campuses and in the administration of government programs, promoting the Black Lives Matter movements, among others. Too often, the politically correct objection is directed at activities and policies that seek to support and promote the interests of those at the margins of our communal lives. To take one example, if all lives did matter equally, there'd be no need for policies to protect people of color from unequal treatment by the legal and law enforcement apparatus, such as we have seen in Ferguson and Baltimore. Too often, those who raise the hue and cry of political correctness are those persons whose privileged position is being challenged, or political leaders using the term as a rallying cry to advance their political agenda. So where does Jesus of Nazareth, the Galilean preacher and prophet, fit into all of this? Well, to start with, often, though not always, those who shout political correctness the loudest are often those who just as loudly profess their allegiance to this Jesus. But it's fair to examine how their actions conform to the behavior and teachings of Jesus. Now, if one reads the Christian Gospels, one sees a Jesus who is most interested in the needs of the poor and the marginalized. Among the liberation theologians, and most recently from Pope Francis, this is sometimes called a preferential option for the poor. According to Kara Dalt, writing on the website U.S. Catholic Faith in Real Life, this phrase, used in particular by the more radical Roman Catholic theologians, may be defined as follows. One of the major developments in Catholic social teaching in the 20th century has been the preferential option for the poor. The option for the poor is simply the idea that, as reflected in canon law, the Christian faithful are obliged to promote social justice and mindful of the precepts of the Lord to assist the poor. It indicates an obligation on the part of those who call themselves Christian, first and foremost, to care for the poor and vulnerable, who Jesus once referred to the least of these, my sisters and brothers. Now, while this phrase, liberation theology, is often used to refer to Roman Catholic theology, Dalt suggests a more universal interpretation. The gospel passage I read earlier supports this interpretation. Jesus tells the rich young man that obedience to the commandments is not sufficient. If he wants to be a true follower of Jesus, he must sell all he has give the money to the poor. The story ends with the despondent young man walking away because he was very wealthy. Now, in modern parlance, this demand by Jesus might be discarded as mere political correctness. Why should we care about the poor, many might ask? Isn't it their own fault that they have lived profligate lives, have not improved themselves, not gotten a better job than slinging hamburgers for the minimum wage? They need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, if they happen to have a boot. This guy Jesus did lots of other things that would be suspect on the PC scale. He associated with tax collectors and prostitutes. Now, hey, wait a minute. I worked for the IRS for 6 years, okay? Not bad, guys. He consorted with lepers. He treated the Samaritan woman with a somewhat checkered romantic past, who he encountered at the well with dignity and respect. He even taught that a Samaritan who assisted a robbery victim was better than the more religiously respectable priest and the Levite. For heaven's sake, Jesus consorted with the 99% rather than the 1%. Now, aren't these the acts of a card-carrying political correctness, Nick? Okay, so we might agree that Jesus had a lifestyle which was very open and accepting, and we might do well to emulate it. But does that mean that Jesus would be upset over every verbal slight to a poor person or person of color? Haven't things simply gone too far, we might ask? Shouldn't people simply let some of these things slide, sticks and stones and all that sort of thing? Well, first of all, in the Gospels, I'm not aware of any time that Jesus said anything disparaging about anyone. Even the Romans, the hated Romans who ruled over Palestine at that time. To be sure, Jesus had criticized the scribes and Pharisees for what he believed to be an overly legalistic interpretation of the Jewish law that failed to preserve its essential purpose. But I'm not aware that these ever became personal attacks on these individuals. And I suppose one might try to make a principled argument that some claims of microaggressions and trigger words begin to infringe on freedom of speech. Haven't we gone a bit too far? I guess this may be a case that where you sit affects where you stand on particular issues. Often these questions relate to the use of language. And I think most of us agree that language is a powerful thing. Language used by those who speak from a place of power and privilege at the center of the public discourse may feel differently from those who sit at the margins and are powerless. I still remember an incident when I was in college, and I frankly can still see it in my mind's eye. I was talking politics one evening with a black student activist, one of the, frankly, the few on the Luther College campus. This was back in the 1960s, just to give the frame of it. In the course of the conversation, I made a reference to Polish people in Representative Clement Cyblaki's district in Milwaukee, using a pejorative term for persons of Polish descent. This other student immediately brought me up short, reminding me that the use of such language was no more acceptable than if I had used the N-word to refer to an African American. To this day, I still remember this encounter. It made me much more sensitive to the use of language. Given the power of language to help or harm, dismissing concerns of how language is used to refer to marginalized persons as mere political correctness should not be acceptable in our political or social discourse. And those who try to do so should be so informed that such an approach is not acceptable. We should be able to have civil and informed debates, and even vigorous debates, over these great issues. What kind of society are we going to be? How do we relate to our fellow human beings and the other animate creatures with whom we share our planet? These raise important and serious questions. But perhaps, rather than relying on the golden rule, that one, do unto others as you wish them to do unto you, we should instead adopt the so-called platinum rule. Do unto others as they would wish to have done to themselves. Blessed be.